Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the podcast of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy. My name is Daniel Fiott, and I'm hosting this first episode where we'll be discussing a recent paper that has been published by Lotje Boswinkel, who's a researcher at CSDS, and Simón, who is the director of the center. And the study, titled Shades of Grim, Scenarios for Ukraine and Global Order, which, by the way, is fully available on the CSDS website at the moment, looks essentially at 4 different scenarios for how the war in Ukraine might pan out. And on top of the 4 scenarios, both Lotje and Lewis also consider some of the wild card factors that might emerge over the coming months and years that may also influence the direction of the war. And on top of that, I think, quite interestingly in the paper, there is also a focus upon what the consequences of the war in Ukraine and each of the scenarios, what consequences they have for global order and other regional security dynamics such as the Indo-Pacific. So first of all, let me welcome the 2 authors, and congratulations, by the way, both to Lotje and Lewis. And Lewis, if I can first turn to you and ask you a very basic question, I guess, which is at the core of the paper. And that is, firstly, what really gave you the idea of writing a paper on future scenarios in Ukraine? I guess, why now? And what were your main aims in actually writing the paper?
Well, thank you, Daniel. And first of all, congratulations on the launch of the podcast. So obviously, we are all paying a lot of attention to the war in Ukraine. Everyone is. And so are we as a research center focusing on security and on foreign policy. But I think 2 key considerations informed our decision to embark on this project now. And by the way, I want to start by thanking policy planners from NATO, the EU, and 12 member states, as well as Indo-Pacific partners for their support throughout the process, as well as other CSDS colleagues, including yourself, Daniel. The first consideration was political and relates to the fact that 2024 is a year of transition, both in the United States and in Europe, and we are expecting a new leadership in the EU, but also in NATO this year. And the second consideration was strategic, and I think it has to do with Russia's apparent military, political, and economic resilience, but also the proliferation of other crises, particularly in the Middle East. So I think this sort of combination of strategic and political uncertainty has triggered questions about how sustainable the West's support for Ukraine is, which sort of crystallized over the last few months around debates on the U.S. supplemental. But beyond that, we really wanted to take this context of political and strategic uncertainty as the starting point for a reflection on the different trajectories that the war may take. And as you were saying, there are possible implications for European and global security. And I think that sort of connects to your question about our aims and about product differentiation, which for us was particularly important. So one of our core propositions at CSDS is to try to understand European security and Europe's global role, starting from the premise that the center of gravity of global military competition, technological innovation, and economic growth has moved towards the Indo-Pacific and is therefore no longer in Europe. So we're paying particular attention to how systemic variables like US-China competition, but also geopolitical dynamics in the Indo-Pacific impinge on European security and debates on Europe's role in the world. So both our research focus and partnerships are very much global in scope, with a particular emphasis on North America and the Indo-Pacific. And yet, over the last few years, whenever we were in Japan or in Korea or in Australia or in the United States, all of our conversations started with the war in Ukraine. So and I know that in the last few months, we've had an explosion of studies applying foresight and scenario development techniques to the war on Ukraine. And there really is a wealth of analysis out there focusing on things like battlefield outcomes, scenarios relating to how Russia itself may evolve, domestic dynamics in Russia, some other centering on Ukraine's politics and economy, and others on EU-Ukraine and EU-Russia relations. And all of these works have been tremendously helpful for us. But we wanted to focus specifically on how the Ukraine war and perhaps more broadly Europe's security architecture intersect with broader dynamics, such as in particular how the US prioritizes its national security resources across different regions, the evolving balance of power between the United States and China, or the evolving relationship between China and Russia. So I think considerations relating to the global and the Indo-Pacific, to the global level and the Indo-Pacific, are central to our research design, and that's what gives this report product differentiation.
Thanks for that, Lewis, and also thanks as well for connecting the study itself a bit more broadly with some of our aims here at CSDS. And I think you were very, very clear on some of our aims there in terms of connecting with partners and also understanding the dynamics of war and conflict and how it intersects with regional security dynamics in Europe. And also farther afield in the Indo-Pacific. So thanks for that. Lotje, I'd like to turn to you now, if possible, and ask you a very basic question, which I think is of quite a lot of importance for our audience. And that is exactly what are the four scenarios? So we have these four scenarios in your paper. Could you briefly try to outline what they are, what they look like, and what our audience should also be thinking about as they themselves look at the conflict dynamic in Ukraine?
Hi, Daniel, of course, and thanks so much for having us. So indeed, we created these four scenarios, and in these four scenarios, we tried to balance the parsimony offered by ideal type scenarios against plausibility. We set the scenarios in late 2025, but we also look a few years further ahead to look at their implications for Euro-Atlantic and global security. Now, the four scenarios that we created are a Ukrainian victory, a Russian victory, protracted war, and a peace for territories political compromise. And as you said, I will briefly try to walk you through them all. So in case of a Ukrainian victory, we see that Ukraine's armed forces are significantly strengthened by a large expansion in Western aid, and Ukraine thereby addresses its ammunition capabilities and manpower and fortification issues. It first uses a defensive strategy that gradually exhausts Russian forces and then launches a new offensive in the spring of 2025. Hereby, Russia suffers significant losses in the east and south, and it is denied access and use of Crimea. And then in a settlement, Russia is forced to withdraw to pre-2022 lines in the Donbass, while Crimea is demilitarized under an international authority. Then a second scenario, Russian victory. Western aid here stalls, and because no further supplemental is passed in the US Congress, and Europeans are insufficiently prepared to step into this void, then Ukraine is increasingly exhausted, while Russian supplies hold steady through critical economic, military, and technological support from actors like China, Iran, North Korea. It then launches a new offensive and gains full control of the Donbass region and also large parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast in the spring of 2025. And then later that year, Russian forces also occupy Kiev and Odessa. In this scenario, a central Ukrainian authority ceases to exist, and much of Ukraine's south and west descend into chaos. Then we go to the scenario of protracted war. Here we see that Western support continues or even increases somewhat, but it still proves too gradual and limited to decisively change the battlefield balance. Russia, meanwhile, sustains large troop and material losses, and it is able to forge also further territorial gains from their side. Now, Russia and Ukraine descend into this grinding attritional fight, but both parties do remain committed and are unwilling to negotiate. And then the fourth and final scenario is one of a political compromise. And here Ukraine and its supporters basically show that they can sustain this war of attrition and exhaust Russian forces. And Ukraine critically steps up its attacks, especially against Crimea, but still it is unable to launch a new offensive. In this scenario, the US remains involved, but it is increasingly skeptical of a total victory. So it begins to urge Ukraine to negotiate, and it uses the promise of NATO and also EU membership as levers. Then the Russian side is persuaded to seek a settlement, as Moscow sees that its war aims are increasingly frustrated, and it also fears the outright loss of Crimea. And then in a negotiated ceasefire, Russia maintains de facto control over the Donbass region, while Crimea is being demilitarized. So in this scenario, there's some sort of East and West Ukraine created.
Thanks, Lotje. Yeah, so four very, I would say, thought-provoking scenarios: a Ukrainian victory, a Russian victory, protracted war, and then political compromise. And I think you set the scene for each one of those very, very well. And in fact, in the paper, you and Lewis also go in a lot more detail on some of the ramifications of each of these scenarios. And I must say also, I was personally quite privileged in attending some of the events that supported the input for this paper, especially as Lewis mentioned at the beginning, some of the meetings with some of the policy planners from both the EU and the NATO side, and also roadshowing the paper before in the US as well. So I found each of the scenarios quite fascinating. But Lotje, another thing that you've done in the paper, and which I think is also really, really interesting to add to our thinking on this question, is also the introduction of a series of wildcards, which I think is also a good way for those reading the report to think about some of those variables or crisis situations that might emerge over the timeline of the study, and which could give us a lot more concern. And also as well have an impact on the direction maybe of each of your scenarios. So maybe you could also talk to us a little bit about, firstly, why are the wildcards there? What are the wildcards as well? And how do you see these wildcards influencing each of the scenarios? So why are they significant, essentially?
Yeah, so good question. And you're highlighting it right, because as you see, our scenarios, they're fairly conventional or not very extreme. And the idea of adding then wildcards came up during one of our meetings with the EU and NATO policy planners, as they wanted us to think a bit more thoroughly through disruptive events and escalation dynamics. Now, the wildcards also offer a very good opportunity to think through these cross-theater linkages that Lewis mentioned before. And they were also therefore selected very much with these broader systemic security dynamics in mind. So the four wildcards that we included are, first of all, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan that draws the US into a broader conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Then we consider a US withdrawal under Trump from the North Atlantic Council and NATO's military command structure. The third wildcard is a Russian use of a tactical nuclear weapon, evoking the US and some European countries to respond with limited conventional strikes against selected Russian military targets. And then the last wildcard involves an escalation into a full-blown Middle Eastern war, which then also draws in some US troops or additional US troops into the Middle East. And then in this scenario, in this cross-scenario wildcard section that we added to the report, we considered how the scenarios would shape the circumstances under each wildcard would occur, and also in turn the way in which each of these wildcards would affect Euro-Atlantic and global security under different Ukraine-related futures. Now, without going into every detail, I want to briefly highlight how these wildcards help us unpack the way in which the war intersects with these broader systemic dynamics. So first, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and a full-fledged war in the Middle East would draw away US attention and resources from Europe. And this would clearly have more devastating consequences in the more pessimistic or grim scenarios in which Ukraine collapses or the war grinds on. But also when we look into the other direction, each of these scenarios would affect the US ability to prepare for and deal with these potential wildcard contingencies. Now, the other two wildcards also have to do with US engagement in Europe, most evidently so clearly under a US withdrawal from NATO, but also, and conversely, a Russian nuclear use could draw the US further in, with then again its own consequences for the US position in the Indo-Pacific.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Lotje, and also for being very clear on the importance of these wildcards for the study, because I think indeed when you do read the paper, the wildcards do add an additional layer, I think, of complication to the way we can think about the ramifications of the war in Ukraine. And Lewis, that's really the final question that I'd like to put to you. You started actually thinking or talking about some of the ramifications, the global ramifications of the war in Ukraine. And that's very much, I would say, the departure point for this study. But I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see each of these scenarios and how they might impact security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific specifically. Lotje also already mentioned one of the wildcard scenarios, which was a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But could you maybe unpack that a little bit more broadly about how you see those dynamics?
Sure. Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for that question, because this cross-theater dynamic is indeed quite central in our study, as Lotje was just explaining, and as I said at the outset. So, by the way, we look at the relationship between Ukraine and the global / Indo-Pacific, and by the way, we use global Indo-Pacific rightly or wrongly interchangeably, and we look at the relationship between Ukraine and the global levels of analysis as a two-way street, in the sense that we believe that we cannot explain the war as a regional phenomenon, in the sense that regional considerations are, of course, key, but extra-European factors are becoming rather important. For instance, from the beginning, China has helped Russia cushion Western economic and political pressure. And I think a good example of that is President Zelensky's accusation about China helping Russia sabotage the peace process in Switzerland. But beyond that, I think China has also been enabling Russia's defense industrial and battlefield machine through the transfer of dual-use goods. And I find all these references about how we need to encourage China to influence Russia to stop the aggression rather naive in light of all that. And then on the other hand, diplomatic, economic, and military support from Indo-Pacific partners like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the ROK, has also helped strengthen Ukraine's resilience and support the Western effort more broadly. And I think the fact that Prime Minister Kishida started his address at the U.S. Congress about 2 months ago, pleading for more U.S. aid for Ukraine, is quite telling here, actually. And then there's traffic in the other direction, which goes to the heart of your question, right? What do the different scenarios mean for dynamics in the Indo-Pacific? And here, I think we really need to focus primarily, and we focus primarily on the implications of Ukraine futures for U.S. military strategy and for U.S. grand strategy more broadly, because that is the main factor connecting both theaters. So just in the interest of time, let me just super briefly focus on the nightmare scenario. A Russian victory. I think a Russian victory and a Ukraine collapse would lead to a far more complicated picture in NATO's eastern flank, because the geographical area in which NATO territory and Russian territory or proxy-controlled territory are in direct contact would be significantly expanded. That means that resourcing deterrence in the new flank would be a lot more challenging than it is today. That means that the demand signal for U.S. military presence in Europe would increase, also putting a serious strain on U.S. resourcing and compromising a necessary U.S. rebalance to Asia. And now people here may be tempted to take comfort on the assumption that Russia is incompetent and that Russia is not in the business of reconstruction, but rather only in the business of destruction, which means that Russia would actually have its hands full, sort of winning the peace, if you will, and that may very well be the case. But China may actually also have an incentive to throw its weight behind Ukraine's reconstruction and political stability, partly to free up Russia's bandwidth and allow Moscow to continue to focus on military modernization and continue its push against the West and NATO in Europe. So I do believe, I think one of our assumptions here is that a Russian victory would open an attack window for China in Asia, would make such attack more likely, whether in Taiwan or elsewhere in the first island chain. And the report would focus on Taiwan specifically. So a Russian victory could undermine deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, peacetime deterrence, and could also complicate America's response to a potential Chinese aggression. I, for one, think, and we've been discussing this quite a lot with Lotje and others, that the U.S. has no option but to prioritize decisively the Indo-Pacific in the event of concurrent or nearly concurrent contingencies. And that leaves Europe exposed, which is why we are insisting so much on the fact that Europeans should work to minimize as much as possible America's involvement in Ukraine and in European deterrence, while recognizing that some degree of U.S. involvement is indispensable, both for political and military reasons.
Thanks, Luis, for unraveling or peeling back the onion layers on this discussion, and also bringing us back as well in the discussion about how some of these dynamics are going to impact also how European decision makers are going to have to think about the war in a much more, I would say, broader and strategic manner than perhaps they're already doing today. And I think your paper is a perfect deep dive for them, especially over the summer months if they have the time, to really get to grips with some of the dynamics that you both have really well explained in this podcast. So thanks so much to Lotje and to Luis. We're going to wrap up this first episode of Strategy Speaks. This is the podcast, as I mentioned at the beginning, of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy. The report, Shades of Grim, Scenarios for Ukraine and Global Order, is also available on our website. Thank you very much again to Lotje and Luis, and please join us for the next episode. Thank you.